Before power, there was silence. Some stories don't begin with fireworks. Some begin with a slow silence. A silence that settles into a billion-dollar mansion where no one ever says what they're truly feeling. And everything changed the night I saw my father hand my stepmother a glass of wine. He smiled at her like she hadn't just wrecked our family from the inside out. Let me rewind. Before the lawyers and locked rooms, there was just me, and a father I desperately wanted to understand. My father, Dan Carter, didn't raise me with bedtime stories or Sunday hugs. He raised me with private jets, security gates, and a staff trained to say yes, sir, before I finished my sentences. He built empires, but at home, I never saw him build anything close to a connection. I used to think it was just how rich men operated, calculated, too busy making history to notice who was getting buried in it. Her name was Melia Lotte. She walked into our life like she was born to belong, calm, confident, radiant. The media called her the Rose from Nothing, a woman who grew up with nothing but became everything a billionaire like my father would want to display beside him. Black, brilliant, beautiful, a past full of church choirs, street wisdom, and survival. She made her story sound like poetry, and I listened, every word, every smile, every glance. At first, she treated me like I mattered, not like Dan's heir, not like a business accessory, but like a real person. She laughed at my stories, sat beside me during family dinners when Dad couldn't be bothered to attend, said things like, "You're not cold like him, you feel everything, Matteo." And one night, she whispered something that changed me. "Your father doesn't really see you, not the real you. Men like him don't know how." And I believed her. I let her voice echo where his silence used to live. Was it affection? Was it manipulation? Was it both? All I knew was I wanted her to keep choosing me, noticing me, believing in me. Even if it meant pushing the man I once idolized further and further away. But the truth? She wasn't building me up. She was breaking me away, one carefully placed compliment at a time. If you've ever questioned someone's love for you because of what someone else whispered in your ear, if you've ever been torn between loyalty and longing, stick around, because when the truth hit, it didn't just ruin reputations, it wrecked illusions. Like, comment, and subscribe, because this story, it's not just drama, it's a warning, it's a lesson, and it's real. By the time the charity gala arrived, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage where everyone knew their lines except me. The event was my father's idea. A celebration of legacy. That word followed us everywhere, etched into invitations, printed on banners, whispered by guests who wore million-dollar smiles and borrowed sincerity. I stood near the edge of the room, watching donors and board members shake my father's hand. Dan Carter, steady, composed, admired. The same man who never noticed when I left the dinner table early as a child. The same man Melia said never truly wanted me. She stood beside him that night, elegant as ever. Her arm rested lightly against his, fingers brushing his sleeve as if to remind everyone she belonged there. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a look I had come to know well. Soft, reassuring, familiar. "We're in this together," it seemed to say. That was when my father lifted a glass of wine and handed it to her. He smiled. Not a forced smile, not a public one, a calm, knowing smile. My chest tightened. I remember thinking, how can he smile at her like that? How could he look so peaceful standing next to the woman who had told me, over and over, that I was nothing more than a convenient obligation to him? Because that was the second thing she planted in me, not loudly, not all at once, that I was raised to protect his image, not because he wanted me close, that every tutor, every security guard, every carefully planned future was just another way to keep me managed. "You were never chosen," she said once, her voice low, almost gentle. "You were assigned." Those words stayed with me. They shaped how I looked at him, how I spoke to him, how I stopped speaking to him. So when I saw that smile at the gala, my first instinct wasn't confusion. It was anger. Because I believed she was right. I believed my father was blind to anything that didn't serve him. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my father had been watching quietly for a long time. He raised his glass next. The room grew still, as if everyone sensed something was about to shift. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate legacy, not money, not influence, but character." Melia's hand stiffened slightly on his arm. I didn't notice it then. He spoke about responsibility, about the weight of choices, about how power reveals who we are when no one thinks we're paying attention. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. Then he turned slightly, just enough to look directly at me, not the distant glance I was used to, not the distracted nod. This time he saw me, and for the first time in years I didn't know how to read his expression. Legacy, he said, is not inherited by blood alone. It is earned through truth. The room went quiet, and that was when everything I thought I understood began to fall apart, because in that moment I realized something terrifying. What if I had been wrong? What if the man I thought had ignored me all my life had actually been protecting me in ways I couldn't see? And what if the woman who claimed to love me had been shaping my pain for her own reasons? That night didn't explode with shouting or chaos, and standing there, between my father and the woman I thought I loved, I understood something too late. When someone convinces you that you were never loved, they don't just steal your trust, they steal your judgment. If you've ever believed a lie because it made sense of your pain, if you've ever chosen the wrong loyalty because it felt safer than being alone, stay with this story, because what came next didn't just change my future, it changed everything. Like the video, leave a comment and subscribe. Your engagement helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. The Carter estate sat on the edge of upstate New York, miles of fenced-off land, marble hallways, private chefs, indoor theaters, and rooms so large they echoed even when you whispered. To the outside world, it was a dream. To me, it was a quiet box of everything, except belonging. Growing up as the only child of Dan Carter, I never lacked material things. My first birthday present was a baby grand piano. At 6, I had a language tutor. By 13, I had a curated college prep plan that mapped out every summer of my teenage life. But what I didn't have was presence, not from the man who provided it all. My father wasn't cruel, he wasn't absent in the traditional sense, he was simply preoccupied. The kind of man who could command a boardroom with 5 words but struggled to look me in the eye for more than 5 seconds. We had staff that handled our meals, security that followed my every move. But I can count on one hand how many times he sat down and asked how my day went. His way of loving me was giving me structure, protection. It's just that none of it felt like love. The silence in our house wasn't loud, it was rehearsed. It was the kind that told you to keep your voice down, not because anyone would scold you, but because no one was going to listen anyway. My bedroom had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the sunrise, but what I remember most was the quiet, not just outside, inside. My mother had passed when I was a toddler. I barely remembered her face, just warmth in photos and a soft voice in old videos I wasn't allowed to share with anyone. After her death, my father buried himself in work. The world praised him for it, said he was strong, said he was focused. But they didn't see how many dinners I ate alone, how many school events were attended by bodyguards instead of parents, how many birthdays were celebrated on speakerphone from a jet somewhere over Europe. Every year, I hoped he'd notice. Every year, he asked me if I was sticking to my schedule. I learned early on that wealth can build comfort, but it doesn't build connection. That's the boy I was when Melia walked into my life. Dan Carter had a rule book for everything. Not that he ever sat me down and explained it, but it was understood. Discipline wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. He expected results. Grades above 95. No scandal, no messy emotions. In his world, success wasn't to be celebrated, it was assumed. As I grew older, our conversations became check-ins. How's the advanced math class? Did the mock interview go well? Are you maintaining your GPA? Never. Are you okay? Are you happy? Do you feel heard? I remember once missing a scholarship competition because I had a severe stomach flu. I couldn't even sit up. He didn't yell, he didn't scold, he just stood at the door, nodded and said, "That's unfortunate. You don't get many chances at this level, Matteo." I was 15. That was his way of teaching resilience. I get it now, in hindsight, but back then all I felt was that I'd disappointed the one person who should have cared more about me than my resume. By the time I turned 17, I was fluent in French, decent in coding, and emotionally numb. His expectations weren't always spoken, but I carried them on my shoulders like they were law. I wasn't allowed to fail. I wasn't allowed to cry. I wasn't allowed to need anything that wasn't measurable. And the saddest part, I actually thought that was normal. So when Millia eventually stepped into our world and smiled at me like I was more than a project, more than a brand extension, I mistook her warmth for rescue. But back then, I didn't see that my father's coldness wasn't the only danger in the room. The real danger wore silk gloves and asked how my heart was doing. I only remember that because Thursdays were usually reserved for donor dinners or internal meetings, which meant my father was rarely home. But that night he asked for us to have dinner, just us, which was rare, suspicious even. The dining room was set by staff, but he dismissed them before we sat. He poured wine, water for me, and cleared his throat like someone who had practiced what he was about to say at least 20 times. "I wanted you to hear this from me," he began, his voice smooth, steady. "I'm getting remarried." For a moment, I didn't react, because I thought I misheard him. Dan Carter, the man who hadn't dated publicly in over a decade, was suddenly engaged. To who? I asked, careful not to let my voice betray the confusion already climbing up my throat. Her name was Melia Lotte. He described her as articulate, grounded, and uniquely attuned to people. "She sees things others miss," he added. I remember feeling my jaw tighten. He had never described anyone that way, not even my mother, from what I could recall. He said quietly, "Long enough to know she belongs here." I didn't argue. Not out loud. But something shifted that night. My father had never consulted me on life decisions, but this one felt personal, because I didn't just lose space at the table. I lost space in his life. It wasn't jealousy, it was displacement. Like the only place I ever occupied in his world was now being rewritten, by a woman I hadn't even met yet. She arrived the next week. Melia didn't walk in like a guest. She walked in like a woman who already belonged. She had this quiet elegance, polished heels, soft neutral tones, eyes that seemed to see past surface pleasantries. She wore her hair swept up the first time I met her, a gold bracelet on her wrist, simple but expensive. My father introduced us like a CEO presenting a new division head. "Matteo, this is Melia. Melia, my son." She smiled. Not too wide, not too forced, it was measured. "I've heard so much about you," she said, voice smooth like warm honey. I nodded. "Can't say the same," I replied bluntly. There was a flicker in her eye then, not offense, not embarrassment, just calculation, like she wasn't surprised by my coldness, like she expected it. As the evening progressed, I noticed how she handled conversation, effortless. She asked about my interests, listened like she actually cared. But it was how she looked at me that unsettled me. There was no condescension, no patronizing tone. But there was something I couldn't place, something unreadable. Like she knew I'd be harder to win, and that was fine. She was patient, polished, prepared. And the strange part? I felt seen. That should have been a good thing. But sometimes, being seen by the wrong person is just the beginning of being controlled. The thing about wealth is that people assume your life is full. But most of the time, it's just full of people paid to act like they care. My father traveled more than he stayed. His schedule changed week to week. Private jets to Zurich, late dinners with investors in Tokyo, full-day retreats in the Hamptons. His presence was scheduled, his absence expected, which meant when Melia moved in, she didn't enter a crowded home. She entered a space echoing with unspoken things. At first, I ignored her. I told myself she was temporary, a misplaced piece in the structure I'd learned to navigate alone. But Dan trusted her quickly, too quickly, and when he left for his usual trips, Melia didn't vanish into the walls like the staff did. She was there, always. She asked if I'd eaten. She lingered after dinner. She sat in the living room while I played piano and didn't pretend to be impressed. She actually listened. She remembered my favorite tea. She let the silence settle before asking questions. She didn't talk like she was trying to impress. She talked like she had nothing to prove. I didn't know how to process that. She wasn't warm like a mother. She wasn't cold like a step anything. She was present. And when someone shows up in a place you've only known emptiness, you stop asking why. You start welcoming the interruption. I began to wait for her footsteps down the hallway, to hear the way she sighed when settling into the couch, always barefoot after a long day. The air around her didn't carry pressure, It carried attention. And after 17 years of being treated like a schedule, I didn't realize how much I craved being noticed. Melia had a way of noticing things even I didn't think mattered. Once, I was sketching on a notepad in the kitchen, not for anyone to see, just quick lines, bored hands. Most people wouldn't give it a glance, but she walked by, paused, and said softly, "You see people in shapes first, don't you? Not labels. That's rare, because yes, I did draw people by shapes, outlines, posture, space between fingers. But no one had ever pointed that out." "Are you studying art?" she asked. "No," I muttered, sliding the sketchbook closed. "Maybe you should," she said. "You notice things the world rushes past." It wasn't flattery. It didn't feel like someone complimenting for effect. Melia didn't just listen, she remembered. She asked about my mother, but only once. When I said I barely recalled her, she didn't press, just nodded and said, "That kind of loss never makes noise, but it never leaves either." She asked what music moved me, what books I hid from tutors because they weren't on track. She made me feel like the pieces of me I was told to suppress were the most valuable ones. She told me once, "Your strength isn't in being your father's son, it's in the fact that you don't have to be." And suddenly, I wanted to tell her things. About the pressure I never voiced, about the nights I stayed up just to catch a moment with Dan when he returned. One that showed me they were human, and without realizing it, I leaned into her presence more than I meant to. Not out of romance, out of relief. She was the only one in that house who seemed to speak the language I'd forgotten I needed to hear. One night, during a late spring evening, I found her in the garden just after sunset. The sky was soft and dim, the air damp from the sprinklers, and she was sitting on the stone bench in a black silk robe with her hair tied up in a loose bun. She looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "You're not asleep?" she asked. "Couldn't," I shrugged, too quiet. She patted the space beside her, and I sat, awkward at first, like a child unsure whether he was allowed to occupy adult spaces. We talked. About nothing and everything. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Not like someone waiting to respond, but like someone who'd already felt what I was feeling and wanted me to know I wasn't strange for it. That night, something inside me moved, shifted. I couldn't name it, but I knew it wasn't just gratitude. It was confusion with a heartbeat, the kind that lived between admiration and attachment. I tried to shake it, tried to tell myself it was misplaced, that I was simply reacting to kindness I'd never known. But the way she touched my hand when saying goodnight lingered. I didn't know where the boundary was. I just knew I didn't want to leave the bench. What terrified me most, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen. Weeks passed. My conversations with Melia deepened. Subtle moments turned into long ones. She'd find me in the library, curl up across the couch, and ask what was on my mind. She always gave space for me to speak first, and I always did. But my father stayed unaware, or chose to be. I tried to bring it up once. We were in his study, the one place he actually seemed relaxed. I said, "You trust her a lot." He looked up from his notes. "Melia?" he asked casually. "Yeah, I mean, she's around a lot. When you're gone." Dan leaned back, blinked slowly, and said, "She's just being kind, Matteo. That's not a crime. Kind." The word hit my chest like cold water, because kindness was the one thing I never truly got from him. And now, it felt like he was dismissing mine. I wanted to tell him more, that I wasn't just appreciating her, that something was growing inside me I couldn't control. But how do you tell a man who built your entire life that his wife might be the first person to actually see you? I shut up. I nodded. He returned to his paperwork. And I left, feeling like I'd just been dismissed back into silence, the same silence Melia had pulled me out of. That night, I sat in my room staring at the ceiling, asking myself the question that would soon unravel everything. Was she the only one who ever made me feel wanted? It started as small moments, a comment here, a question there, but slowly I found myself seeking her out more often, not out of rebellion, but out of comfort. Melia had a way of appearing just when I was questioning something, like she could hear my thoughts echoing down the mansion's cold hallways. We began spending more time in the library. Late evenings when Dan was gone, she'd curl up on the opposite couch, book in hand, soft jazz playing in the background. But when I did speak, she always listened. Not the way my father listened, distracted, halfway in a spreadsheet. She once asked, "What do you fear most?" She didn't blink. Instead, she looked down at her cup and replied, "The world doesn't need another Dan Carter. The world needs someone who understands people, not because they were critical of my father, but because she said them like she truly believed I had something else inside me, something worth growing." I began to talk more, about the pressure to succeed, about the loneliness of being a name rather than a person, about how the Carter last name felt like a chain more than a crown. She didn't interrupt. She never offered advice. She just let me bleed into the room and treated the mess like something beautiful. She said once, "You're more aware of your own emotions than men twice your age. That's a strength, not a flaw." No one had ever told me that before. So I kept coming back, to the kitchen after midnight, to the garden bench after my runs, to her voice when my father's absence grew louder than usual. Looking back, I didn't realize how easily she became my center. But when someone gives you what you've been starved of your whole life, even in small doses, you start confusing nourishment with need. It was a Sunday night. Rain tapped softly against the window panes, and the power flickered briefly before backup lights took over. I found her in the reading room, barefoot in a long sweater, sipping tea. I sat on the carpet beside her armchair, a book in my hand I hadn't opened. We talked, or rather, I talked, about how my father missed my piano recital in freshman year, how he once called my drawings interesting before handing me back my sketchbook without looking twice, how every time I thought we had a moment, it disappeared before it became real. She listened, legs folded beneath her, head tilted with quiet empathy. When I finished, she set her cup down gently and said, "It's not that he doesn't care, he just doesn't see your heart." I looked up. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, speaking softly, not as a manipulator, but as someone stating a fact too painful to say louder. "He sees your achievements. He sees the surface. But he doesn't see how deeply you feel things, how you carry other people's moods, how much you want to be more than just the next Carter." She paused, eyes locked with mine. "You crave connection. That's not weakness, that's life." For a moment the silence stretched between us, not awkward, but heavy. And then she added, barely above a whisper, "I see it, Matteo. Even if he never does." Those words, they didn't just land, they rewrote something in me. I sat there for a long time, processing the shift, the realization that someone had finally noticed the invisible parts of me and named them with care. From that moment, doubt became a shadow behind every compliment my father gave. Was he saying it because he had to? Or was it just performance? Because the woman in the chair beside me saw things he never acknowledged, and that made her voice louder than his, even when she wasn't speaking. I was standing at the edge of the kitchen one evening when I saw her crying, not loudly, not for attention. "Are you all right?" I asked. She turned quickly, startled, then smiled with that practiced calm. "Just tired," she said. "Your father's had a long week. Sometimes it spills over." I hesitated, then stepped closer. "You don't have to pretend around me." Her eyes softened. "I'm not pretending. I just forget sometimes that no one really asks how I'm doing." The weight of that hit deeper than I expected. She too was invisible in a house that only acknowledged strength. "You don't deserve that," I said. She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "Neither do you." I don't know what happened next in my mind, but something turned. That moment, raw, unscripted, made me feel like we were the only two real people in the entire estate. Like if I could shield her from the weight she carried, maybe she could finally be safe. And maybe I could too. I didn't move closer, but my heart did. And as the days passed, her presence became less of a comfort and more of a craving. Every laugh, every glance, every shared silence, I began reading into it all. I told myself she needed me, that she saw me in a way no one else had, that what we had wasn't wrong, it was misunderstood. And when you're 17 and desperate to belong, you don't need much to believe fantasy over reality. The line was always blurry, and she kept it that way. She never touched me inappropriately, she never flirted outright, but she never pulled away either. When I handed her a book I thought she'd love, she touched my hand and let her fingers linger a little too long. When I offered to walk her to her room one night, she let me, even though the lights were on and the house was quiet. She once fell asleep in the sunroom while I was working on a painting. Her head tilted just enough to rest near my knee, and when I shifted slightly, when I brushed her shoulder by mistake, She stirred, looked at me, and whispered, "You have the kindest eyes." I didn't sleep that night, not because anything happened, but because nothing did, and yet it felt like everything had. But she created an emotional rhythm I couldn't stop dancing to, always just enough to keep me hungry, never enough to satisfy. And I began to shape my moods around hers, my self-worth around her responses. If she was distant, I spiraled in silence. She didn't trap me with actions, she trained me with subtle permission, and I didn't realize it until I was already too far gone. Dan Carter had built his fortune by noticing what others ignored. He wasn't the type of man who reacted loudly. He reacted late, but only after seeing everything clearly, a new marriage settling into unfamiliar rooms. But patterns began to surface. More time alone, or worse, more time withdrawn even when present. Dan noticed the change not because Matteo complained, but because he stopped asking questions altogether. That silence was unfamiliar. Dan also noticed something else. Melia had begun positioning herself in spaces she didn't need to be. She asked questions that sounded thoughtful but landed oddly specific. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, she remembered everything. Dan had trusted her intelligence. That was part of why he admired her. But intelligence, he knew, was neutral. It depended entirely on intent. And intent was not always announced. So he began doing what he had done countless times before, not as a husband, but as a strategist, without suspicion or accusation. He asked an old associate to revisit Melia's professional history, not to find fault, but to understand patterns, just clarity. Because Dan had learned one thing over decades of building power: when something feels off, it usually already is. And the man who waits for proof before preparing often pays the highest price. She was far too composed for that. Her questions came wrapped in concern, for the family, for stability, for what came after. One afternoon, while Dan reviewed documents in his study, she leaned casually against the doorway and asked, "Have you ever thought about what happens if something unexpected occurs?" Dan looked up, unbothered. "In what sense?" he asked. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I just mean, you've worked so hard. Matteo deserves security, clear structure. I wouldn't want misunderstandings later." The phrasing was careful, protective, reasonable. She asked about trusts, how they were layered, who controlled them, what conditions applied. She asked about estate plans, not pressing, just curious. She mentioned future protections, the kind of phrase that sounded selfless but left room for interpretation. Dan answered selectively, enough to acknowledge her concern, not enough to expose anything meaningful. He watched her reactions instead, how her eyes sharpened at certain answers, how she nodded slowly when details were withheld, how she redirected the conversation when he pressed back. She never demanded, she guided, and Dan filed that away, not as guilt, as data. I wasn't supposed to be in my father's office. I knew that, but I was looking for a book, one he'd mentioned years ago, and his door was open. The room smelled like leather and paper. Everything had its place. I saw the folder on the desk by accident. My name was on it. I shouldn't have opened it. But curiosity isn't always loud. Sometimes it just leans forward. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand, clauses tied to behavior, responsibility, evaluation. It didn't read like love. It read like control. I felt heat rise in my chest. So this was it. This was how my father planned to manage me forever, with paperwork instead of trust. That night, I brought it up to Melia. I didn't accuse. I asked. She listened quietly, eyes narrowing just enough to show concern. "That sounds restrictive," she said carefully, "like he doesn't trust you to decide your own future." The words hit a nerve already exposed. I told myself she was being honest, that she was the only one willing to say what everyone else danced around. And slowly, without realizing it, I began shifting suspicion away from her and placing it squarely on the man who had raised me. Dan never asked me about the folder. He never asked Melia about her questions. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He adjusted the structure, not to punish, to protect. He created layers that required transparency, placed responsibilities before privileges. ensured that no single influence could redirect the future unchecked. From the outside, nothing changed. Dan wasn't reacting emotionally, he was preparing responsibly, because in his world, the loudest moves were rarely the most effective. And while I believed I was uncovering the truth, my father was quietly making sure that when it finally surfaced, no one could misuse it again. The Carter name carried weight, but that weight had never felt heavier than the day I opened the envelope. It came in a black folder, no formal announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet delivery through our legal counsel, hand-delivered to me while my father was away. Inside was a financial restructuring plan, not for the company. My name was still tied to the family trust, technically, but access to the accounts, frozen. Instead, a modest stipend was detailed, monthly, fixed, tied to an independent account. Just enough to live, not enough to coast. There was a note, unsigned but unmistakably his. You need to learn who you are without my name, and without her voice in your ear. DC, I sat with it for over an hour. No calls, no text from him, just silence. It wasn't a punishment in the traditional sense. He had simply withdrawn the cushion. And in doing so, he forced a choice I didn't know I'd have to make. Live like everyone else, or prove him wrong by collapsing. Melia found me staring at the folder that evening. She didn't say anything at first, just placed a glass of water beside me and sat across the room. When I finally looked up, she met my eyes and asked, gently, "How long have you felt like he was waiting for you to fail?" I didn't answer, because the question hurt more than the paperwork. I wasn't just being cut off. I was being challenged to exist outside of everything I'd ever known. And I wasn't ready. The apartment was in Queens, but a far cry from marble staircases and ocean view balconies. It had one bedroom, laminate floors, and a heater that wheezed at night. No silence padded by distance and money, just me, and a small desk with peeling corners that I turned into a workspace. Dan didn't just cut me off, he relocated me. The family lawyers handled the transition, and suddenly I was on my own, not in rebellion, but in logistics. But I couldn't hear her comfort without feeling my father's absence louder. And so, I got a job, part-time, basic admin at a community arts center, a quiet space with children's drawings on the wall and coffee that tasted like cardboard. The first paycheck I received felt like a novelty. The second, a reality check. I had never budgeted, never meal prepped. Now I was calculating groceries by ounces and stretching shampoo bottles for weeks. But beneath the discomfort, something real emerged. I started understanding the world beyond glass towers. I saw mothers working double shifts to pay for after-school programs. Teenagers who took 2 buses just to practice piano. Volunteers who gave time they barely had to make a difference. I was learning how to survive, not by inheritance, but by interaction. The more I wondered who I was without the Empire's shadow. She said she was in the neighborhood, though I suspected otherwise. She brought food in a paper bag, pasta from a place she remembered I liked. No driver, no staff, just her in jeans and a sweatshirt. We sat on the floor, eating in silence until I finally asked, "Why do you think he did this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back against the wall, arms folded, eyes distant. Then she said, "Because he never wanted us to be close." I stared at her. She nodded softly. "He watched us, every glance, every conversation. He saw that I understood you, that you were opening up, and that terrified him." She picked at the corner of the takeout box. "He doesn't want connection, he wants control, even of how you feel." I didn't know what to say, but her voice filled the room like certainty. I married him because I believed I could bring something different into that house. But from day one, he made sure to remind me that some doors don't open, even if you knock gently. She looked down, quieter now. "You weren't supposed to choose me. You were supposed to obey him." Her voice trembled just slightly, the kind of tremble that disarmed me. But I didn't, because in that moment, I felt guilty, not for being here, but for ever questioning her loyalty. I stopped trying to see both sides. I stopped waiting for a phone call that never came. And I started choosing her, not out of romantic obsession, not yet, but out of belief. Because every time I looked at how Dan had handled the situation, I saw only strategy. And every time I looked at Melia, I saw response. She texted me every morning, checked in after my shifts, asked what I needed, not what I was doing. I started telling her more. About how hard it was to navigate public life now that people knew I'd been cut off. How my last name got whispers in the grocery store. How I hated the way tabloids framed the story. She never offered solutions, just solidarity. She said once, "Empires don't fall because of enemies. They fall because the people inside forget how to care." And I clung to that, because caring was all I had left. By the time the second month passed, I stopped referring to my father as Dad. I just called him Dan in conversation. And when Milia asked if I needed anything else, anything at all, I said no, because what I needed was someone who chose me without legacy attached. And in that broken place, I believed that someone was her. Dan Carter had always preferred precision over noise. He didn't react with threats. He restructured the landscape so by the time anyone noticed, they were already standing outside the gate. In the weeks following Matteo's move, Dan quietly began redrawing the lines of control within his empire. Accounts were consolidated. Ownership shares were shifted into irrevocable foundations. Key contracts, especially those involving long-term estate planning, were revised under tighter conditions. Everything was above board. Everything was legal. But the effect was surgical. Milia's name, once adjacent to certain trusts and committees as an informal gesture of inclusion, now appeared in far fewer places. She wasn't removed. She was sidelined, subtly, permanently, and Dan didn't say a word. He simply moved, quietly, intentionally. Milia, however, noticed. At first, she thought she was being paranoid. Then she saw a copy of the new Foundation Charter, her name no longer listed as an alternate voice on the advisory panel. When she brought it up in passing, Dan smiled and said, "We've streamlined the structure. Too many voices muddy the mission." It wasn't a conversation, it was a closure. She tried again later, during dinner. Just wondering, the educational endowment language, it changed. I used to co-sign certain releases. Dan folded his napkin. Only directors make those decisions now. That was the moment she realized. This wasn't about policy, it was a statement. Her influence was not just shrinking. It was being erased without resistance, and that terrified her more than any argument ever could. When control starts slipping, desperation becomes strategy. Milia wasn't used to being dismissed, so she pivoted, gently but with purpose. She called a private legal contact she had used before her marriage, someone discreet. She didn't ask for anything illegal, she just asked questions. If marital influence was once acknowledged in documentation and then removed without communication, what does that imply? The attorney's answers were measured, cautious. It was clear that Milia wasn't trying to build a case. She was testing the temperature of one. Next, she brought up Matteo, publicly this time. At a board luncheon where Dan had excused himself briefly, Milia leaned into a conversation with two Foundation members and remarked, "I'm worried about Matteo. This forced independence. It's not just character development, it's abandonment. Emotional exile, really." The words weren't accusations. She started offering suggestions during meetings she was no longer invited to. She asked questions she knew would circle back to Dan. And she started dropping subtle lines. "I know more about the family's legacy than most. After all, I've lived every inch of it." But he noticed, and so did his legal team. She wasn't declaring war. She was bluffing control, trying to remind people that she was still part of the empire, even as the walls quietly moved in. But for the first time, her words didn't land with weight, because authority without access is just noise. It was a Wednesday evening. I had come back to the Carter estate to pick up an old sketch pad I'd left behind, one I hadn't told anyone I wanted to retrieve. The housekeeper let me in. Milia wasn't supposed to be home. Dan was in Chicago for a conference, but as I made my way past the study, I heard her voice. Firm, measured, different. I stopped just outside the door. It was cracked open an inch. "I'm telling you, it won't work unless he reacts. And so far, nothing. He's too composed." A male voice on the other end, muffled. Then Milia again. "I can't keep holding Matteo in this space forever. At some point the loyalty becomes fragile. If Dan doesn't make a mistake soon, I'll have to force his hand." I froze. Not out of fear, out of confusion. Because the voice she used wasn't the one she used with me. It was layered, cold underneath, strategic above. Another pause. Then she said something that snapped every nerve in my body. He still believes I'm the only one in his corner. He doesn't know what we're trying to preserve. I backed away, quietly, fast, careful not to let the door shift. By the time I reached the hallway, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Was she talking about me? Or was I hearing something out of context? Either way, something had shifted. For the first time, doubt entered the room where her voice used to be my shelter. Dan had always known the value of timing. Exposing a lie too early made you look paranoid. Too late, you looked weak. But at the right moment, it changed everything. That's why he chose the gala. Every year, the Carter Foundation hosted a black-tie charity event. It was part fundraiser, part legacy parade, a showcase of vision, values, and public power. This year, Dan made a few changes. He elevated the list of speakers, adding himself to the closing remarks. And he requested full media coverage, not for publicity, but for permanence. He simply began to align the players around a central stage. Recordings, ethically obtained, were filed. It was clarity prepared for public understanding. Dan didn't want to ruin reputations. He wanted truth to remove illusions. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is not defend his legacy, but reveal what's been threatening it, quietly, thoroughly, and in front of every pair of eyes that once looked away. The invitation arrived embossed in deep navy, the Carter Foundation crest pressed in silver. Legacy and family, an evening of purpose. The words felt deliberate. Dan Carter had never been sentimental in his branding. His events were typically framed around innovation, progress, and economic impact. This theme was different. Personal. The gala was set at a private cultural center overlooking Manhattan's skyline, a place reserved for moments meant to be remembered. Tall glass walls framed the city below, lights flickering like a constellation of ambition. From the moment guests arrived, everything felt intentional. Photographs lined the entrance, not of Dan alone, but of Milestones, the Foundation's first community grant. Youth programs launched under Carter funding. A rare photo of Dan with Mateo as a child, standing stiffly but side by side. It wasn't nostalgia, it was narrative. Melia noticed immediately. She stood beside Dan as photographers snapped images, her posture flawless, her smile measured. But her eyes moved quickly, scanning the room, cataloguing details. The theme unsettled her. Family and legacy weren't topics Dan highlighted unless he had something to prove. Mateo arrived late. He wore a tailored suit he'd paid for himself. It fit well, but not with the effortless confidence wealth once gave him. He moved through the room cautiously, aware of whispers, aware of glances. This was the first time he'd been back in this world since everything changed, and Dan noticed. Not outwardly, but he noticed. The room filled quickly. Board members from every Carter subsidiary, trustees from affiliated foundations, legal advisors who rarely attended public events unless necessary. The press stood along the perimeter, not intrusive but alert. Cameras were positioned with care, microphones tested discreetly. This wasn't a casual gathering, it was a controlled environment. Melia sensed it too. She greeted donors, laughed at appropriate moments, played the role she'd perfected, the composed partner, the articulate presence beside a powerful man. But something felt off. Too many attorneys, too many unfamiliar faces from the compliance division, too much structure beneath the surface. Mateo gravitated toward the back of the room, nursing a glass of water, eyes moving between his father and Melia. He felt like an observer in a story he used to live inside. Dan moved calmly among guests, exchanging pleasantries, thanking supporters, but his focus never drifted far from the center of the room. He was waiting. When everyone had settled, when conversations reached their peak hum, Dan stepped toward the podium. The room quieted, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence commanded it. Dan began with gratitude. He spoke about responsibility, how success without accountability hollowed out even the strongest institutions. He spoke about leadership not as authority, but as restraint. The audience nodded along, nothing controversial. Then his tone shifted. Legacy, he said, is often misunderstood. People think it's about inheritance, about what's passed down. He paused. But real legacy is about what survives scrutiny. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He continued, measured. Families, like companies, require trust, but trust must be protected, not assumed. Matteo felt his chest tighten. Dan wasn't speaking abstractly, he was building something. Over the past year, Dan said, I've been forced to examine not just my structures, but my blind spots. Melia's smile faltered for half a second, so brief most wouldn't notice. Matteo noticed. Dan's eyes moved through the room, finally landing on his son. And I learned something difficult, he continued. Sometimes, the greatest threat to legacy doesn't come from outside forces. It comes from inside, wearing familiarity, comfort, and proximity. The silence thickened. Dan hadn't raised his voice, hadn't accused anyone, but every word sharpened. Dan took a breath, then he stepped aside. The screen behind him lit up. Documents appeared, contracts with highlighted clauses, call logs with timestamps, financial records tracing influence attempts that had never fully materialized. Dan spoke calmly as each slide appeared. Influence isn't always loud, he said. Sometimes it arrives disguised as care. Melia froze. The room held its breath. Dan turned slightly, not toward her but toward the audience. These records show repeated attempts to redirect authority without disclosure, to pressure outcomes without accountability, to create divisions where unity was essential. Gasps rippled. Matteo's vision blurred, because suddenly pieces fell into place, conversations, doubts, moments that no longer aligned. Dan wasn't humiliating her. He wasn't attacking. He was exposing truth, cleanly, thoroughly. Melia tried to speak, but the room had already heard enough. Dan ended simply. This foundation exists to protect people, not power plays. The screen went dark. Silence followed, and in that silence Matteo finally understood. The man he thought had abandoned him had been preparing to protect him all along. The silence after Dan's presentation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was clarity hitting the room like cold wind. For a moment, no one moved. Then murmurs began, low at first, like people unsure if they were allowed to process what they'd just seen. Melia stood still beside the table, her expression unreadable. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just smiled, thin, artificial, and took a slow step toward the microphone. I think, she said, voice steady, that what we've just seen requires context. Some sympathetic, most not. I've never pretended to be perfect, she began, looking directly at the trustees seated in the front row. I entered this family from a different world. Yes, I asked questions. I studied the system because I had to. Her voice carried, graceful as always, but the conviction behind it was cracked. What woman in my position wouldn't want clarity on the structure she was being absorbed into? A few nods, but more hesitation. She turned to Dan. I never acted alone. There were gaps, yes, but communication could have solved them. Instead, I was silenced by exclusion. Dan didn't respond. Melia turned toward the room once more. You don't build a life beside a man like Dan Carter without learning how to survive scrutiny. But tonight, I see this wasn't about scrutiny. She paused. It was about strategy, a final attempt to flip the narrative. But it didn't land, because everyone could feel it, the distance between her words and the weight of the evidence that had already spoken. And truth, when seen, doesn't ask for interpretation. I stood at the back of the room, frozen. I'd spent months believing Melia was the only person who understood me. I let her voice become louder than my own instincts. But as I watched her speak, I saw the pattern for the first time. The way she framed her actions, the way she pulled emotion like a lever, the way she used truths to anchor lies. I remembered the way she used to listen, eyes soft, hands gently folded. The way she said, "He doesn't see your heart." The way she leaned into my pain just enough to become part of it, and I realized it wasn't connection, it was control. I had been a vessel, not a partner. She saw my gaps and filled them not with healing but with dependency, and now, standing here, I didn't know who I was without that version of her. I stumbled out of the hall and into the courtyard, gasping for air. But really, I was waking up. Tears blurred my vision, not from shame but from grief. She didn't have to shout to destroy me. She whispered just enough to shift my world. Dan stood quietly as the room slowly recalibrated. He simply stepped forward, addressed the microphone again and said, "This isn't about revenge, it's about restoration." He looked at Melia, and for the first time, the mask fell, not on her but on him. He looked tired, not defeated, just done. Melia Lott Carter's formal association with the Carter Foundation and its subsidiaries has ended, effective immediately. Legal advisors have been briefed. Personal contracts have been revoked under review of conflict clauses. He paused, not for effect but out of finality. There will be no further discussion in this setting. He stepped down, just like that. No scene, no dragging, no shaming, because sometimes the most powerful form of consequence is quiet removal. Melia didn't speak. She stood still for a moment, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to push back on her behalf. No one did. No gasps, just silence. Because when truth finally arrives, it doesn't ask for a spotlight, it just stands. The next morning, the tabloids lit up. But not with scandal. Dan's team released a formal statement confirming the separation, personal and financial. It was worded precisely. Melia's image, once the poised, articulate symbol of modern philanthropy, evaporated from the website by midday. Press inquiries were rerouted, board members distanced, sponsorships rescinded invitations. In private, she tried reaching out to Matteo, once, a brief message. None of it was fake. Not with you. He didn't reply. Her condo, paid for through a discretionary trust she once claimed not to care about, was reclaimed. No public farewell, no press conference. And Matteo, he didn't celebrate, he didn't speak about her for weeks, because when manipulation ends, what remains isn't anger. It's emptiness. But emptiness can be the beginning of clarity. After the gala, life didn't collapse, it slowed. The apartment in Queens felt different now. Not smaller, just quieter in a way I hadn't known before. The kind of quiet that didn't rush to fill itself with distraction. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. Stopped expecting messages that wouldn't come. Melia was gone, not just from the estate, but from my internal dialogue. Her voice, once so familiar, faded into something distant and unreliable. For the first time in months, my thoughts were my own. I went to work. I came home. I cooked meals that tasted plain but honest. Some nights I sat on the edge of my bed and replayed conversations I'd had with her, not to punish myself, but to understand where I'd surrendered my judgment. I didn't hate her. That surprised me. What I felt instead was disappointment, not in her, but in myself. I had wanted belonging so badly that I let someone else define it for me. And in doing so, I lost sight of the man I was becoming. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden clarity, just days that asked me to sit with discomfort and learn from it. And slowly, without announcement, I began to accept the truth. Being used didn't make me weak. Refusing to learn from it would. The letter arrived on a Monday. Handwritten, no legal header, no formal language. Just an envelope with my name in my father's careful script. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the table all evening, afraid of what it might contain. Eventually, I sat down and unfolded the page. Matteo, I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly, but I need you to know something important. I never stopped believing in you, even when I stepped back. Distance isn't rejection when it's paired with intention. You needed space to hear yourself again, and I needed time to ensure you'd be safe once you did. If you're ready, I'd like to talk, not as father and son with expectations, but as two men learning from the same mistake in different ways. There was no apology for my pain. There was no defense of his decisions. Just an opening, an invitation. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it beside my bed. That night, I slept without replaying the past. I didn't start therapy because someone suggested it. I started because I was tired of being confused by my own reactions. The therapist didn't ask about Melia right away. She asked about my childhood, about expectations, about what it felt like to be prepared for success, but not for self-understanding. Week by week, patterns emerged. I learned how easily validation could become dependency when emotional needs went unmet, how admiration could turn into attachment when boundaries weren't modeled early. And I learned something harder. I had participated, not consciously, not maliciously, but I had chosen comfort over clarity, Acknowledging that didn't break me, it grounded me. Outside therapy, I took responsibility in quieter ways. I apologized to coworkers when I snapped unnecessarily. I listened more. I stopped rushing to fill silence with performance. I began painting again, not to impress but to process. The work wasn't pretty, but it was honest, and for the first time, honesty felt like progress. I waited 2 weeks before responding to my father's letter. Not because I wasn't ready, because I wanted to be sure my response came from growth, not guilt. When I finally picked up the phone, my hands didn't shake. "Dad," I said when he answered. There was a pause, then a quiet breath on the other end. "I've been doing some work," I continued. "On myself, I think. I understand things better now. I'm not calling to ask for anything," I said. "I just wanted you to know I see where I went wrong too." Silence again. Then he said softly, "That's all I ever hoped for." We didn't solve everything in that conversation. We didn't need to. I was speaking from ownership, and that changed everything. The cab slowed as it turned into the long palm-lined driveway of the Wells estate. The house looked the same, grand, stoic, untouched by time. But Matteo wasn't the same. No longer the boy with clenched fists and silent longing. No longer the man consumed by shadows of rejection. He stepped out of the car with no entourage, no announcement, just a single bag over his shoulder and quiet resolution in his chest. Maria, the long-serving housekeeper, blinked in surprise when she saw him at the door. "Signor Matteo," she whispered, as if saying his name might break the spell. "I'm not here to fight, Maria. Just tell him I came as a man, not a mistake." She nodded slowly, eyes misting, and stepped aside. Matteo entered the same hallway where he once felt like an intruder in his own bloodline, but this time he wasn't seeking approval. He was seeking truth, whatever form it took. In the library, Dan Wells stood by the window, arms crossed. He didn't look shocked. Perhaps age or experience had prepared him for this moment. Or maybe he'd been waiting for it too. Neither man rushed to speak. The silence held more weight than anger ever did. Matteo finally spoke. "I came because I need clarity, not comfort. I don't want your sympathy. I don't need an apology for the past. I just want to understand why you treated me like a threat to your legacy, when all I ever wanted was to be part of it." Dan turned slowly, face unreadable. "You think I never asked myself that?" Dan didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff his chest or use boardroom rhetoric. For the first time, he spoke to Matteo not as a CEO or an estranged father, but as a man stripped of titles. "You remind me of the parts of me I didn't want to pass on," Dan began, hands folded. "Ambition with rage, drive with recklessness. I thought keeping you away would protect what I built, but it only made you carry wounds you didn't deserve." Matteo's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I didn't know how to be a father to someone like you," Dan said quietly. "You were born out of a time when I wasn't proud of who I was. And when you came into this world—" I froze. I thought silence would be less damaging than rejection. I was wrong. Matteo looked down. "You didn't have to choose silence or shame. You could have just shown up. Once." Dan exhaled. "I wasn't man enough then. I barely am now." Neither man moved. The fire crackled in the background, the only sound in the room. "I spent years trying to be everything you'd respect," Matteo admitted. "Business school, boardrooms, tailored suits. But I realized I never needed to become you. I just needed to become someone I respected." Dan nodded. "And you have. I see that now." It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, just raw honesty exchanged across decades of misunderstanding. They didn't talk about shares, empires, or surnames, just about who they had become and who they no longer needed to be. As the evening deepened, the mood shifted from confrontation to clarity. Dan reached into a drawer, placing a thick folder on the coffee table. "The lawyers kept this updated, just in case." Matteo didn't look at it. "I'm not here for the money," he said calmly. "Not the properties, not the trust, not even the board seat. That name, Wells, used to feel like a wall I couldn't scale. Now I see it's just a name. What matters is the man I build behind it." Dan frowned slightly. "You'd walk away from everything?" Matteo shrugged lightly. "I'm not walking away. I'm choosing differently. I don't want to inherit your kingdom. I want to build my own, clean of all the lies, schemes, and silence." Dan leaned back, taking in his son. "You sound like someone I wish I'd raised." Mateo smiled faintly. Maybe this is who I became because you didn't. The moment was sharp but not cruel. It was truth stripped of bitterness. I'll still need your guidance, Mateo said after a pause. Not your wealth, just your wisdom, if you're willing to give it. Dan swallowed. His voice was rough. That I can offer. Mateo pushed the folder back across the table. Then let this be our real beginning. It wasn't about rejecting Dan's empire, it was about reclaiming Mateo's freedom, and Dan respected that far more than blind loyalty. The silence returned, but it wasn't awkward, it was thick with something sacred. Dan rose slowly. For a moment, Mateo thought he was going to end the conversation there. But instead, Dan crossed the room, stopped in front of him, and reached out. No speech, no theatrics. He placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder and looked into his eyes. I kept my distance for years, but if you'll let me, I want to stand beside you now. Mateo didn't reply with words. He nodded, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to be seen. Not as a mistake, not as a burden, but as a man who had earned his place. Dan pulled him into an embrace, awkward, stiff at first, but then something broke inside the older man. His shoulders trembled. Mateo felt it, the grief, the pride, the years they both lost, and the man they both found in the aftermath. When Dan finally stepped back, his eyes were misted. You didn't become me, Mateo. You became better. You became whole. Mateo smiled, quietly emotional. It took breaking first. Dan nodded. Sometimes thunder doesn't bring destruction. It clears the air. Father and son stood in the room that once felt like a cage. Now it felt like common ground. No inheritance could match what they rebuilt that evening. And for the first time, neither man needed power to feel like they belonged. The ribbon was gold, not to symbolize wealth, but courage. Courage to start over. Courage to break cycles that for decades were mistaken for tradition. Dan held one end. Mateo held the other. They didn't speak much as the cameras clicked and supporters gathered under the soft Los Angeles sun outside the new headquarters of the Cavern Legacy Center. A foundation not for profit, not for status, but for the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the boys like Mateo once was. Ready? Mateo asked, scissors in hand. Dan didn't smile, not quite, but his nod held something far more powerful, pride without pridefulness. The ribbon fell. Applause rose. Inside, the walls were clean, bright. Inspirational quotes lined one hallway, quotes Dan never would have cared about in his younger days. But now, he understood the power of words spoken at the right time. Mateo had carefully selected each quote. Their first cohort of teens sat in the rec room with licensed counselors and mentors, people who had been trained to listen, not lecture. People who could see a cracked voice as a cry for help, not disrespect. Dan wandered through the space, watching a boy who couldn't be older than 14 grip the arms of a chair, staring at the floor as if it might save him. He reminded Dan of Mateo, back when love felt like a question he didn't deserve to ask. Mateo approached the boy slowly, knelt beside him, and simply said, "You don't have to talk today, just stay, that's enough." That was the mission. No glitzy logo, no gala dinners, just service, just rebuilding broken mirrors. That night, after the last staff member left and the lights dimmed to a warm glow, Dan stood in front of the dedication plaque. For every child who grew up pretending they were okay, may they never have to pretend again. He ran his fingers over the engraved words. His eyes clouded. Mateo didn't notice. He was in the corner, filling out intake forms, lost in the work. But Dan noticed something in himself. For once, he didn't need to prove anything. Not to the world, not even to his son. He had become someone who built, not for legacy or empire, but for healing. Her name was Callie. She wasn't impressed by lineage, didn't care for corporate titles, and thought the term heir sounded more like a burden than a blessing. They met at a community event hosted by the foundation. She taught art therapy, simple tools, complex healing, crayons and construction paper. She believed emotions could be named with colors when words ran dry. Mateo wasn't trying to fall in love. He wasn't even trying to flirt. He was just listening. And Callie noticed. He stayed after the event ended, asking her about her methods, her work, her hope for kids who felt nothing and everything all at once. He didn't talk about Dan. Didn't talk about the mansion, the trauma, or the therapy. He asked about her favorite color growing up. Orange, she said. Not the color itself, the warmth it gave. Felt like home. That night, they walked the long way to the parking lot. He offered her nothing but attention, and in today's world, that was rare currency. Weeks passed. Then months. No grand gestures, no roses on balconies. Just consistent presence, deep respect, honesty. She met Dan once, briefly. He was polite, reserved, but afterward he asked Matteo, "You love her?" Matteo thought about it for a second and replied, "I love what I'm like when I'm around her. I'm not guarding, I'm not performing, I'm just me." Dan didn't respond, but he reached out, squeezed his son's shoulder, and whispered, "That's what I should have been for you." Matteo and Callie's love wasn't the explosive kind. It was patient, kind, the kind you could build a life on, not just a moment. And for Matteo, that was enough. Melia hadn't changed much on the outside. Her wardrobe still screamed class. Her hair was always done. Her heels still announced her arrival in any room, but her phone didn't ring like it used to. Her name no longer circulated in boardroom whispers. The silence was louder now. She sat in her penthouse apartment, walls lined with paintings she once claimed to understand. A glass of untouched wine sat on the table. Her television flickered quietly. It was a local news segment, nothing dramatic, just a feel-good piece on the Cavern Legacy Center's 5th anniversary. The camera zoomed in on Matteo giving a keynote speech. Older now, more assured, calm. Dan sat beside him, hands folded, eyes full of something rare, pride with no strings attached. Callie was there too, behind the scenes, helping kids paint murals that now covered the walls of the building. Melia stared at the screen, not bitter, but still, like someone watching a version of the future she once thought she'd control. She wasn't angry. She wasn't envious, but she was alone. She muted the volume and just watched Matteo speak. He didn't even mention her. And somehow that hurt the most, because she had shaped his pain. But she had no place in his healing. As the camera panned to a boy reading a poem about emotional courage, Melia leaned back in her chair and whispered to no one. He really did become more than his last name, and for the first time in years she cried. Not because she lost him, but because she never knew who he could be. The final frame wasn't dramatic. It was simple, Matteo standing on a rooftop, overlooking the city, not from a place of power, but reflection, not in a suit, but a hoodie. One hand in his pocket, the other holding a journal. His voice came soft, layered over the city's fading sunset. For a long time, I believed I had to become who they needed me to be. The heir, the strategist, the legacy. But power alone can't heal what silence broke. I had to lose status, pride, comfort, to find something worth keeping. I stopped chasing what people expected, and started facing what I'd buried. And in that quiet, after the noise, the betrayal, the fear, truth found me, not the truth about them, the truth about me. Power built my family, but truth rebuilt me. As the final words echoed, the screen faded to black. No dramatic score, no closing credits with fireworks, just silence, the kind that doesn't hurt but heals. And in that silence, the audience felt it too. The story was never about wealth, betrayal, or inheritance.